Samantha ran until her lungs burned, and the rain blinded her, because the men who murdered her husband were hunting her next. When her strength finally gave out, she collapsed into the arms of a stranger, a man with tattoos on his hands and danger in his eyes. And the moment he saw the bruises on her body, the Mafia boss asked one quiet question that would start a war. Who hurt you? If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. The zipper on Samantha's coat had been broken for 2 weeks. She kept meaning to fix it. The same way she kept meaning to eat a real dinner. Kept meaning to return her mother's calls. Kept meaning to do all the small maintenance tasks that keep a life from looking like it's falling apart from the outside. The problem was, from the inside, it already had. She pulled the coat tighter and let herself into the apartment, the key stuck in the lock the way it always did in cold weather. Daniel had promised to fix that too. He'd had a whole list of things he was going to fix: the sticky lock, the leaking kitchen tap, the loose tile in the bathroom that rocked slightly underfoot and made a hollow sound, like something missing beneath the surface. He'd laughed when she added things to the list. "We just got married, Sam. Give me a chance." He'd said it like they had all the time in the world. They had 6 weeks. Inside, the apartment was exactly as she'd left it, which meant it was exactly as he'd left it too, because Samantha hadn't moved anything since the funeral. His jacket still hung on the hook by the door. His coffee mug sat in the drying rack. A half-finished crossword on the kitchen table, one corner folded up like he'd been saving his place. She set her grocery bag down and stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, doing the thing she always did when she first came home. Waiting. For what? She couldn't have said. She opened the crackers and ate them standing at the counter. 4. Then 6. She stopped when she realized she wasn't tasting them. On the shelf above the television, the box sat where it always sat. Dark wood, small brass keyhole. Unremarkable to look at the kind of thing you'd pass at a market stall without stopping. Daniel had brought it home 3 months into their marriage, on a Tuesday evening in September that smelled like rain and the pasta Samantha had been making. He'd set it on the kitchen table with the quiet, deliberate movement of a man placing something fragile. "I need you to hold on to this for me." She'd looked up from the stove. "What is it?" "Just some things." He hadn't met her eyes when he said it. A key, a drive, work stuff. Daniel managed logistics for a mid-sized shipping company. Or so she understood it. He didn't talk about work often, and when he did, the details were vague in the comfortable way of someone whose job was genuinely too dull to describe. Samantha had never thought to press. She'd had no reason to. He'd reached across the table and taken both her hands. "If anything ever happens to me, protect this. Don't let anyone find it." He'd looked at her then, direct and certain, and something else she hadn't had a name for at the time. "Promise me, Sam." She had laughed, gently. "Daniel, you're being dramatic." He'd smiled, sad and soft and patient. Like he understood something she didn't, and had accepted that she wasn't ready to hear it yet. "Promise me anyway." "Fine, I promise." She'd squeezed his hands. "Nothing is going to happen to you." He hadn't answered that part. Samantha looked at the box now from across the room. The brass keyhole caught the lamplight. She had kept her promise, hadn't opened it, hadn't touched it, hadn't told anyone it existed. But keeping a promise made in ignorance felt different than keeping one made in understanding. She understood more now. Not everything. Not enough. But enough to know that the box was not work stuff, and her husband had not died in a random robbery, and whatever was locked inside that dark wood had something to do with why. She turned away from it and went to run the bath. On the edge of the tub, she sat and let the water fill. Steam rose in slow curls. Her reflection appeared in the bathroom mirror across from her pale, thin, blonde hair damp from the rain. Eyes that looked like they belonged to someone who had been frightened for a long time and learned to carry it quietly. She had met Daniel Cole at a friend's dinner party on a cold February evening. He had been sitting at the far end of the table looking slightly out of place, in a good way too broad for the narrow dining chair, laughing too loud at something, completely unself-conscious about it. She had liked that immediately. The ease of him. The way he moved through rooms like he'd already decided to enjoy himself and was simply waiting to see what shape that would take. They had dated for 7 months. Gotten engaged in October. Married in August. He'd talked constantly about leaving the city. Finding somewhere quieter. A house with a garden, maybe. Somewhere the kids can have a dog. He'd said it so often it had become its own kind of prayer, low and recurring and certain. a future he repeated out loud to make it real. "I'm trying to fix things," he'd told her once, late at night, when they were lying in the dark, and she'd asked why he seemed tired all the time. "Before we start our family, I just need a little more time." She had thought he meant money. She had kissed his shoulder and told him they had time. They did not have time. 17 days ago, 2 officers had knocked on her door at 11 in the morning and told her Daniel had been found in his car 3 miles from their apartment, a single gunshot. The investigation was ongoing. They were sorry for her loss. They would be in touch. They had not been in touch. Samantha turned off the tap and sat in the quiet. On the shelf in the other room, the box waited, and somewhere outside, though she didn't know it yet, a black car had been parked below her window for the 3rd night in a row. She was still telling herself it meant nothing. The lock on the front door rattled once in the wind. She held very still and listened. Nothing. She was almost out of time. The official report said armed robbery. Samantha had read it so many times the words had stopped meaning anything. She could recite it like a grocery list now. Victim found in vehicle. Single gunshot wound. No witnesses. Wallet and phone missing. Neat. Efficient. The kind of language that turned a person into a file number, and a file number into something easy to close. She didn't believe a word of it. She hadn't believed it from the moment the 2 officers left her doorway, the way they'd exchanged that small glance when she asked which precinct was handling the case, the way the taller one had cleared his throat before answering, the way neither of them had left a card. The funeral had been small. Samantha had no family close enough to fill pews, and Daniel's side had arrived in that careful, quiet way of people attending an event they'd half expected. His mother had held Samantha's hand during the service and said nothing at all, which somehow felt more honest than everything else combined. She remembered standing at the graveside in the gray October light, watching them lower the casket, thinking one clear and terrible thought. He knew this was coming. She hadn't said it out loud. She wasn't sure she was ready to believe it out loud. But it sat in her chest like a splinter from that day forward, small, persistent, working its way deeper every time she tried not to think about it. The first strange thing happened 4 days after the funeral. She came home to find the front closet open, not broken into, opened, neatly. The coats pushed to one side, the boxes on the upper shelf shifted slightly out of alignment, nothing taken, as far as she could tell. She told herself she'd left it open herself, told herself grief made you forgetful and scattered and prone to imagining things. She double-locked the door that night for the first time. The phone calls started the following week. Unknown numbers, always after 9 in the evening. When she answered, silence, not empty silence, but the breathing kind. The kind that meant someone was there, listening, deciding. She stopped answering after the 3rd call. They kept coming anyway. Then there was the man outside the coffee shop. She'd been sitting at a window table with both hands wrapped around a cup she wasn't drinking, watching the street without really seeing it, when she noticed him. Dark coat, still. He wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't waiting for anyone, wasn't doing the ordinary performance of a person simply standing somewhere. He was watching her building entrance across the street, with the focused patience of someone being paid to. When she looked up again 10 minutes later, he was gone. She went home and stood in front of the shelf where the box sat, and finally allowed herself to ask the question she'd been avoiding since the funeral. "What did you do, Daniel?" She didn't touch the box. She had promised, but she stayed there for a long time, looking at it, trying to reconstruct her husband from the fragments she'd been left with, the tiredness he carried, the phone calls he stepped outside to take, the nights he came home later than expected and held her a little too long before letting go, like a man reminding himself what he was doing it for. "I'm trying to fix things." He hadn't been talking about money. She understood that now, with a cold and settling certainty. Whatever Daniel had been involved in, whatever world he had been trying to quietly step out of before they started their life together, it had followed him to the end. And now it was standing outside coffee shops, calling after 9, shifting boxes in her closet with careful, practiced hands, and it wanted something she had. 3 weeks after the funeral, she found Daniel's second phone. It had been taped inside the back panel of the bathroom cabinet, the kind of hiding place that required knowing exactly where to look. She wouldn't have found it at all if the panel hadn't come slightly loose when she reached for the aspirin. A small black phone, prepaid, the kind that left no contract trail. 7 missed calls from a number saved under a single initial, R. She had stared at it for a long time. She didn't call the number back. Something animal and instinctive told her not to. Instead, she wrapped the phone in a cloth and put it in her coat pocket and walked around with it for 2 days, not sure what she was going to do with it, not sure what it meant, not sure how many more things her husband had been keeping just out of sight. The answer, it turned out, was enough. Enough to get him killed. Enough that the men who had killed him were now watching her apartment and breathing into phones late at night and running out of patience. She didn't know all of that yet. Not then. She was still in the stage of grief that looks like numbness, but is actually the mind's last act of protection, keeping the full weight of a thing just far enough away that the person underneath it doesn't get crushed before they're ready. But the weight was coming. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks and 4 days after they buried Daniel Cole, Samantha was sitting at the kitchen table with the crossword she still hadn't been able to bring herself to finish when the knock came. Not a normal knock. 3 deliberate strikes, evenly spaced. The kind of knock that wasn't asking whether she was home. It already knew. She looked at the door, then at the box on the shelf, then at the door again. The knock came a second time. Same rhythm, same patience. The sound of something that had already decided it wasn't leaving. Samantha stood up slowly, the chair scraping against the tile, and walked toward the door. She told herself it was nothing. She had gotten very good at telling herself that. She opened the door. 3 men stood in the hallway. They didn't wait to be invited in. The first man stepped forward before Samantha could react, his shoulder hitting the door hard enough to send her stumbling backward into the kitchen counter. The second came in after him. The third stayed in the doorway, pulling it shut behind him with a quiet click that somehow sounded worse than a slam. Like they weren't in a hurry. Like they had done this before and knew exactly how it went. Samantha gripped the counter edge and looked at the 3 of them. They were not the kind of men you'd notice on the street. That was the first thing she registered. No visible weapons. No theatrical menace. Just 3 ordinarily dressed men standing in her kitchen with the particular stillness of people who didn't need to perform a threat because they were one. The one who had pushed through first was the tallest. Heavy through the shoulders. A jaw that looked like it had been broken at least once and set slightly wrong. He looked around the apartment slowly, the way someone does when they're cataloging a space rather than admiring it. His eyes landed on her. "We're going to keep this simple," he said. "Where is the key your husband left you?" Samantha's grip tightened on the counter. "I don't know what you're talking about." He looked at her the way adults look at children who have said something they know to be untrue. Patient. Faintly tired. "Mrs. Cole?" He said her name like he'd been saying it for a while in rooms she hadn't been in. "Your husband took something that didn't belong to him. We want it back. The key. The drive. Whatever he gave you before he died. My husband is dead." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He was robbed. The police. The police," the second man said from near the window, not looking at her, "are not going to help you." The room went very quiet. Samantha looked at the shelf above the television. She couldn't help it. It was involuntary. The way your eyes move toward the thing you're trying to protect. A fraction of a second, but the tall man caught it. His gaze followed hers to the box. "There it is," he said quietly. "Don't." The word left her before she'd decided to say it. She moved without thinking, putting herself between the man and the shelf. It was a stupid thing to do. Some part of her knew that even as she did it. But the box was the last thing Daniel had trusted her with, and she was not going to stand in her own kitchen and hand it over to the men who had killed him. The tall man looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not respect exactly, but a recalibration. Then he nodded at the man by the window. The first blow caught her across the left cheekbone. She hit the floor hard, the world tilting sideways, the kitchen light swinging in her vision like a pendulum. She tasted blood where the inside of her cheek had caught her teeth. Her palms burned from the impact against the tile. She heard them moving through the apartment. Drawers pulled open, cushions lifted, the scrape of furniture being moved. She pushed herself up onto her hands and tried to stand. Her legs didn't cooperate immediately. The box. The tall man crouched in front of her, bringing his face level with hers. Up close, his eyes were flat, in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. Anger had edges. This had none. "Open it. I don't have the combination." "That's not what I asked. I can't open it." She held his gaze even though every instinct told her to look away. "I don't know the combination. Daniel never told me. It wasn't entirely a lie." She had the key. It was sewn into the lining of her winter coat in the closet, where she'd hidden it the night after the first strange phone call. Some quiet survival instinct guiding her hands. But the drive inside required a password she'd never been given. And the box itself had a second lock she hadn't been able to open. The man studied her face, measuring the truth of it. Then he stood up and picked the box up off the shelf himself. Samantha lunged forward. The third man caught her by the arm and held her back easily, her feet barely finding purchase on the tile as she pulled against his grip. She watched the tall man turn the box over in his hands, examine the keyhole, and set it under his arm. "Where's the key, Mrs. Cole?" "I told you. I don't. He hit her again. Her head snapped sideways and she would have fallen if the third man hadn't been holding her up. Stars fractured across her vision. Her ear rang with a high, thin sound. Last time. His voice had not changed in pitch or temperature. The key. She said nothing. She didn't decide to be brave. There was nothing heroic about it. She simply found, at the bottom of whatever had been keeping her upright since Daniel died, something harder than fear. A refusal, small and stubborn and irrational. She said nothing. The tall man looked at the other two. Something passed between them, a decision made without words. Then the third man wrenched her arms behind her back and marched her toward the door. And the world became movement and cold air, and the dark stairwell and the service door at the back of the building swinging open into the alley. A car was waiting. Black. Engine running. The same one from outside her window. The trunk was already open. She fought. She fought with everything that was left in her elbows, feet, the back of her skull. She got one arm free and managed to scratch at the third man's face before the tall one grabbed her around the waist and lifted her off the ground entirely, folding her into the trunk with the efficient ease of a man who measured everything by whether it got the job done. The lid came down. Darkness. She lay there in the pitch black, breathing hard, her cheek throbbing, her wrists already aching, listening to the 3 doors of the car close one by one. Then the engine shifted into gear, and Samantha Cole, widow, 29 years old, who had only ever wanted a quiet life, and a dog and a man who hummed while he cooked, understood for the first time exactly how much danger Daniel had left her in. The car moved. She started thinking about how to get out. The trunk smelled like motor oil and cold metal. Samantha lay on her side, knees drawn up, and focused on breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way you breathe when panic is pressing against the inside of your chest, like something trying to get out, and you know that if you let it win, you are finished. She was not finished. Not yet. The car moved through what felt like city streets, stopping and starting, turns she couldn't map in the dark. She tried to count the seconds between movements, tried to build some picture of direction, but pain kept interrupting. Her cheekbone pulsed with every heartbeat, and her wrists, where the third man had twisted them, felt swollen and wrong. She thought about Daniel, not the version of him she'd been reconstructing piece by painful piece over the past 3 weeks. Not the man with the second phone and the vague work hours and the sadness he carried in his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking. She thought about the other Daniel, the one who laughed too loud at dinner tables. The one who mapped out the garden they were going to have, plant by plant, variety by variety, with the specific enthusiasm of a man who needed to believe in something growing. You should have told me, she thought, not with anger. There was no room for anger right now. Just the clean, aching truth of it. You should have told me and I would have been afraid, but I would have known. And knowing is always better than this. The car stopped. Not a traffic stop. A full, settled stop. The engine idled for a moment, then cut out entirely. Voices outside. Muffled, but close and tense in the way of men who had not expected to be having a conversation. The tall man's voice, lower and harder than the others. Someone else responding, unfamiliar, aggressive, a third voice cutting across both of them. Not her men, someone else's. Some kind of dispute on the street, the kind that required everyone's full attention and no witnesses. Samantha moved. She rolled onto her back and pulled her knees to her chest, feeling along the roof of the trunk with both hands. Modern cars had emergency releases, a small lever, usually glow in the dark, built into the latch mechanism. She had read that once, years ago. The kind of idle safety fact you file away, never expecting to use. She ran her palms across the metal in long, sweeping arcs, fingers searching. The voices outside rose sharply. She moved faster. Her fingertips found a small plastic tab, smooth and slightly raised. She grabbed it and pulled. The trunk released with a soft mechanical click that to her ears sounded like a gunshot. She froze, waited. The voices didn't stop. Nobody came. She pushed the lid up 2 inches and looked out through the gap. Rain, cobblestones slick and black under orange streetlight. The 3 men stood 20 feet ahead, backs to her, facing 2 other figures she didn't recognize. Their attention was total. Bodies angled forward. The unmistakable posture of men deciding whether a situation was about to become violent. Samantha pushed the trunk open and climbed out. She moved on instinct, bare feet hitting the wet cobblestones they had taken her shoes at some point. She hadn't even registered it until now and turned away from the voices and walked fast, then faster, into the nearest gap between buildings. She ran. It was not the running of someone who had a plan. It was the running of something released pure and animal and forward. Her feet found every sharp edge on the pavement. The rain hit her face and plastered her blonde hair flat and soaked through Daniel's old coat, the worn brown one she'd grabbed from the hook on her way out of the apartment 3 lifetimes ago. She didn't look back. Looking back was how you fell. She turned left, then right, then left again, through a narrow alley that opened onto a wider street lined with old brick buildings, neon signs bleeding red and amber into the rain puddles below. The city looked different at this level. Lower, darker. Like the version of itself it kept hidden from people who still had somewhere safe to go. Her lungs began to burn. She slowed to a walk without deciding to, her body making the decision on her behalf. The adrenaline that had carried her out of the trunk was metabolizing fast, and beneath it was everything she'd been running on for 3 weeks: grief, and crackers, and disrupted sleep, and 2 blows to the face, and it was not enough. It had never really been enough. She had simply been moving too fast to notice. She stopped under a street lamp and pressed her back against the brick wall and breathed. Her cheek throbbed. Her wrists ached. Her feet were bleeding from the cobblestones. She could feel the sting of it with every step, the wet cold of the pavement against cuts she couldn't see. "Keep moving, Samantha." She pushed off the wall and kept moving, but the street ahead was beginning to tilt. She noticed it the way you notice the first signs of fainting, a narrowing at the edges of vision, the lights blooming slightly larger than they should, a sensation of the ground becoming less reliable beneath her feet. Her body was calling in a debt she didn't have the means to pay. Not tonight. Not after this. She tried to walk faster. Her legs disagreed. The rain pressed down. The cobblestones gleamed. Somewhere behind her, distant now, she could hear a car accelerating, whether hers or someone else's. She had no way of knowing and no time to find out. The alley ahead blurred at the edges. She reached for the wall to steady herself and found only air. The ground came up to meet her, and then it didn't. Something stopped it. Something stopped her, firm and certain and immediate. 2 hands catching her before she hit the pavement, one at her back and one beneath her arm, pulling her upright against a solid wall of warmth she had not expected to find in the middle of a rainy street at the bottom of the worst night of her life. She looked up. A man stood over her. Tall, dark suit soaked through with rain. Dark hair pushed back from a face that was all hard angles and unreadable calm. A tattoo curled up the side of his neck. Another crossed the back of the hand still braced against her arm. He was looking down at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not pity, not surprise, something quieter than both. His eyes moved to her face, to the bruise rising on her cheekbone, to the split at the corner of her lip, to the finger marks visible on her wrists, where the coat had ridden up. His jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, and filled with something that made the rain, and the pain, and the fear recede for just a moment, the way a very large sound can make smaller sounds disappear. "Who hurt you?" Samantha's vision closed in from the edges, and the night went dark. Gabriel Christian did not panic. It was not something he was capable of anymore if he ever had been. Panic required a belief that situations could not be controlled, and Gabriel had spent the better part of 15 years ensuring that every situation he stepped into was one he had already mapped 3 moves ahead. He did not encounter surprises. He encountered variables he hadn't yet accounted for. The woman collapsing in his arms on a rain-soaked street at 11:43 at night was a variable. He caught her weight easily. She was too light, far too light for someone her height. The kind of lightness that spoke of weeks rather than days of neglect, and looked down at her face for a moment before looking up at the street around him. His 2 men had stopped walking. They stood several feet back, umbrellas lowered, watching him with the careful blankness of men well trained enough to wait for instruction rather than offer opinions. Gabriel looked at the woman again. She was young, late 20s, blonde hair soaked flat against pale skin. A bruise was blooming across her left cheekbone with the deep, purpling authority of something recent within the last few hours. The corner of her lip was split. When the sleeve of her coat fell back against his forearm, he saw the marks on her wrists, 4 fingers on one side, a thumb on the other, pressed into her skin like a signature. Someone had grabbed her, hard, and held on. His eyes moved down. No shoes. Her feet were bleeding against the wet cobblestones, small dark smears in the lamplight. She was wearing a man's coat, old and oversized, the kind a woman keeps because it belonged to someone she isn't ready to stop carrying. Gabriel took all of this in over the span of approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at his driver. "Bring the car around." She didn't regain consciousness on the drive. Gabriel sat across from her in the back of the car and watched her breathe measured, even, the deep unconsciousness of a body that had simply exceeded its limit and shut down rather than negotiate further. One of his men had wrapped her feet in a clean cloth from the first aid kit under the seat. The bruise on her face had darkened another shade in the warmth of the car. He didn't look away from her. He was a man who had seen considerable violence in his life, had ordered some of it, had absorbed the rest with the detached efficiency of someone who understood it as a language crude, but legible. He was not sentimental about it. But there was something about the specific grammar of this woman's injuries that settled in him like a coal. This was not the violence of a fight. This was the violence of a message. Someone had hurt her carefully, not to kill, not in rage, but to communicate something, to reduce her, to make her small enough to manage. Gabriel did not like that particular dialect at all. The car passed through the east gate of his estate and came to a stop on the inner drive. He carried her inside himself, his housekeeper, a composed woman named Mrs. Ford, who had worked for him for 11 years and had learned to receive unusual situations without visible reaction, met him in the entrance hall, took one look at the unconscious blonde woman in his arms, and went immediately to prepare the guest suite on the second floor. He laid her on the bed. For a moment he stood there in the quiet room, looking at her. The rain outside pressed against the windows. Somewhere downstairs his security team would be running plates, pulling street footage, doing the ordinary machinery of finding out what he'd walked into. They were good at that. He trusted them to deliver what he needed. He pulled the blanket up and left the room. She woke just after 2 a.m. Gabriel was in the armchair by the window when it happened. He had dismissed the housekeeper an hour ago and stayed himself, which he chose not to examine too closely. He heard the exact moment her breathing changed, watched her surface through the layers of unconsciousness, her brow contracting first, then her hands, fingers pressing into the blanket like she was checking whether the surface beneath her was real. Her eyes opened, blue, darker than he'd expected. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the room, the high walls, the lamp, the heavy curtains, then at him. He watched her process each thing in sequence, watched the exact moment her body remembered what had happened, and sent the signal, because she sat up fast and pulled the blanket against herself, and looked at the door in one continuous movement. "You're safe." He said it before she could speak. Quiet, flat, not a comfort of fact. She looked at him. He remained in the chair, deliberately still, both hands visible, the posture of a man communicating that he had no immediate intention. He had done this before, not this exactly, but the essential task of convincing a frightened person that the room they were in was not another threat. It required patience and the complete suppression of anything that could be read as pressure. "Where am I?" Her voice was rough, low. "My home." He paused. "You collapsed. I caught you." Something moved across her face, the recollection arriving. She looked down at her bandaged feet, at the cleaned cut on her wrist, at the glass of water on the nightstand she hadn't yet noticed. She reached for it slowly and drank. Gabriel watched her and said nothing, letting the silence do the work that words would only interrupt. Finally she looked at him again. Really looked the way people look when they're past the first fear and into the harder question of who, exactly, they've landed with. He let her look. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that filled a doorframe without trying. Dark hair, pushed back, a jaw that had never been described as kind. The tattoo on his neck was an elaborate piece, dark ink climbing from collar to jaw, and the one crossing his right hand was a rose, thorned and precise. He did not look like safety. He knew that. "Who are you?" she asked. Gabriel considered the question with the brief, practiced pause of a man who had learned that the answer to that particular question depended enormously on who was asking. "My name is Gabriel Christian." She didn't react to it, which meant she didn't know it, which told him something important about how far outside this world she actually was. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "Tell me your name," he said, "and then tell me who put those marks on your wrists." She held the water glass in both hands and looked at him for a long moment. "Samantha," she said quietly. Samantha Cole. The name hit him like a door opening onto a room he hadn't expected to find. He kept his expression exactly where it was, but his mind had already started moving. Gabriel said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked at her the same level. Unreadable expression he'd worn since she opened her eyes, the one that gave nothing away and asked for everything. Samantha had the unsettling sense of being read, not the way people glance at you and form quick impressions. The way someone reads a document they've been handed and need to fully understand before they respond. Then he stood up. "Are you hungry?" It was so far from what she'd expected him to say that she didn't answer immediately. He was already moving toward the door, unhurried, the dark fabric of his suit jacket shifting across broad shoulders that belonged to a man who had never once in his life been told he took up too much space. She stopped, recalibrated. Yes, he left. She heard quiet movement downstairs, the low register of a voice giving instructions she couldn't make out. Samantha sat in the silence of the room and tried to assemble her thoughts into something functional. She was in a house that was not a house so much as a statement. High ceilings, dark wood, everything expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The kind of wealth that had been present long enough to become simply the texture of things. Through the window she could see the edge of a lit courtyard, and beyond it a perimeter wall. And beyond that, nothing. No neighboring buildings, no street noise, no ordinary geography of the city she'd been running through an hour ago. She was very far from her apartment. She was very far from everything familiar. She looked at her bandaged feet. At the clean cloth someone had wrapped her wrists in while she was unconscious. At the glass of water on the nightstand crystal. She noticed now. Crystal on a nightstand next to a woman who had been eating crackers over a sink for 3 weeks. She almost laughed. She pressed her fingers against her bruised cheek instead, and used the pain to stay focused. Gabriel returned 20 minutes later carrying a tray himself, which surprised her more than it should have. She had already formed a picture of him as a man insulated from ordinary tasks by layers of people paid to perform them. The tray held soup, bread, sliced fruit, another glass of water. He set it on the bed beside her without ceremony, and returned to the armchair. She ate. She was too hungry to perform reluctance. He watched her without apology, the way he seemed to do everything directly, without the social softening most people applied to make their attention less obvious. It should have felt invasive. Somehow it didn't. There was nothing predatory in it. He was simply a man who had decided to pay attention, and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. When she finished, he said, "The men who took you. Describe them." She did. The tall one with the broken jaw, the one by the window, the third who had held her arms. She kept her voice even, and her descriptions precise, focusing on details: height, build, the particular way the tall one had moved through her apartment like he was memorizing it. Gabriel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "They said your husband took something that belonged to them," he said. Not a question. "Yes, a key, a drive." She looked at him carefully. "How do you know that?" "Because that is the kind of thing men like those ask for." He paused. "Did your husband give you these things?" She held his gaze. She had no particular reason to trust this man. He had caught her when she fell, had brought her here. He had fed her, and bandaged her feet, and sat in an armchair through the night watching over a stranger. But none of that answered the question of who he was, or what he wanted. People could be kind for bad reasons. She had learned that recently. "His name was Daniel Cole," she said instead, watching his face. There it was again. That almost imperceptible stillness. A man accustomed to controlling his reactions, executing that control a fraction of a second too late. "You knew him," she said. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. "I knew of him," he said finally. "Not personally, but his name was known to me." "How?" He considered how to answer that. She could see him weighing it, not whether to lie, she didn't think, but how much truth the situation called for, and in what order. "Your husband worked for a criminal organization," Gabriel said. "Not mine. A separate network. Significant. Brutal in ways that even people in my world consider excessive." He let that settle before continuing. "From what I understood, he had been trying to leave that organization for some time. Quietly, carefully." Samantha looked at her hands. The soup bowl sat empty on the tray. Outside, the rain had eased to a whisper against the windows. She had known. On some level, in the part of herself she'd been refusing to consult, she had known since the officers left her doorway with their careful non-answers and their borrowed condolences. She had known in the way you know things you aren't ready to hold yet, keeping them at arm's length until the moment arrives when you have no choice but to pick them up. The moment had arrived. "He was trying to leave," she said quietly, "before we started our family." "Yes, and they killed him for it." Gabriel didn't soften it, most likely for what he took when he left, or what they believed he intended to do with it. A long silence opened between them. Samantha sat in it, and let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of what it meant. Not the shock of it, she was past shock, but the grief underneath the shock. The specific sorrow of understanding that the man she loved had been carrying something this heavy, alone, and had smiled at her across kitchen tables and talked about gardens and dogs and had chosen, every single day, to protect her from knowing. He had loved her that much. It had cost him everything. She pressed her fingers to her eyes briefly. then lowered them. "There's a box," she said. "He gave it to me before he died. A key and a drive inside. The men who took me, they have the box, but they don't have the key." Gabriel's expression sharpened by a fraction. "Where's the key?" "Sewn into the lining of this coat." She looked down at the worn brown fabric, still draped across her lap. Daniel's coat, the one she'd grabbed without thinking. "I hid it the night I started getting the phone calls." Gabriel looked at the coat, then at her. For the first time since she'd opened her eyes in this room, something shifted in his face, not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. A recognition, perhaps. The look of a man who understood the particular intelligence of a frightened person who still manages to think. "You protected it," he said. "I made a promise," Samantha said simply. Gabriel was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with the direct, undecorated attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. "Then we need to talk," he said, "about what your husband left behind." Gabriel's study was on the ground floor. Samantha followed him down a wide staircase, her bandaged feet silent on the dark hardwood, her hand trailing the banister more for reassurance than balance. The house was quiet at this hour. That specific 3 a.m., quiet that feels different from ordinary silence, thicker and more honest. The world stripped down to only what it actually is. The study was all dark shelving and low lamplight. A desk that had clearly been worked at for years, not decorative, not staged, but lived in. The surface carrying the comfortable disorder of a mind that moved fast and didn't always file things away before moving on. Gabriel rounded the desk and opened a laptop without sitting down. He gestured to the chair across from him. Samantha sat and placed the coat across her knees. She found the seam by feel a section along the left inner lining she had unpicked and restitched herself the night after the first phone call, the kind of careful domestic sabotage that had felt melodramatic at the time and now felt like the only intelligent thing she had done in 3 weeks. She worked the stitching loose with her thumbnail until the fabric gave, and reached inside. The key was small, brass, ordinary looking in her palm. She set it on the desk between them. Gabriel looked at it without touching it. "The box is gone," he said. "But the drive is what matters. The box was just a container." "They don't have the drive," Samantha said. He looked up. Daniel didn't put the drive in the box. She reached into the interior pocket of the coat deeper, toward the back, and produced a small flat USB drive taped inside a folded square of paper. He put something else in the box, a decoy, an empty drive in a case that looked identical. She placed it beside the key. "He told me the night he gave me the box. He said if they ever find the box, they find nothing. The real one stays with you." Something moved through Gabriel's expression. Not surprise, exactly more the particular quality of attention a man gives when he is revising his understanding of a situation upward. "He planned for this," Gabriel said. "Yes." The word landed in her chest with the weight of everything it meant. Daniel had planned for the possibility of his own death, had engineered a trail of misdirection with quiet, methodical care, had hidden the truth inside a coat she'd grabbed from a hook on pure instinct. He had trusted her even with the parts he couldn't explain. Gabriel took the drive and inserted it into the laptop. A password prompt appeared immediately. He looked at her. Samantha unfolded the paper the drive had been taped to. On it, in Daniel's handwriting small and precise, the handwriting of a man who measured twice, was a single line of numbers and letters she had not let herself look at until now. She read the password aloud. The drive opened. What filled the screen was not what she expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Documents, maybe, or photographs. Instead, the first thing Gabriel opened was a financial file, and the numbers inside it were large enough that she read them twice to confirm she hadn't misplaced a decimal. "That's..." She stopped. "Approximately $4.3 million, Gabriel said, his voice carrying the particular evenness of a man who had seen large numbers before and was focusing on what they meant rather than what they were. "In an offshore account." He paused. "Under your name." The room was very quiet. Samantha looked at the screen. At her own name, sitting above a number that bore no relationship to any life she had ever lived or imagined living. Samantha Cole. The same name on the sympathy cards stacked on her kitchen table. The same name on the lease of a studio apartment where crackers counted as dinner. "He put it in my name," she said. "Before he died." Gabriel scrolled through the file. Months before. The transfers were incremental, small enough not to flag automated monitoring. He was careful about it. She understood then. Not all of it, but the shape of it. Daniel had not simply been leaving the organization. He had been dismantling his connection to it piece by piece, quietly, Over time, moving money he had earned through things she would never fully know the details of, converting it into something clean, something that existed only in her name, untouchable by the people he was leaving behind. It was supposed to be their future, a house with a garden, a dog, somewhere quiet. The money that was meant to build that life was sitting on a screen in a stranger's study at 3 a.m. while Daniel was 3 weeks in the ground. She pressed her hand flat against the desk. Gabriel gave her a moment. He did that, she had noticed, allowed silences their full weight, rather than rushing to fill them. It was an unusual quality in anyone. In a man like him, it was almost startling. "There's more," he said quietly. He opened the second folder. What loaded onto the screen was a different kind of document entirely. Names, dates, transaction records, photographs. The organized, deliberate accumulation of evidence, compiled by someone who had spent considerable time inside a machine and learned exactly where its gears were. He was building a case against them, Samantha said. A comprehensive one, Gabriel scrolled slowly. Names of principals, shell company structures, evidence of at least 3 murders connected to the organization. Money trails going back 7 years. He paused on a particular document. Your husband was not just leaving, Samantha. He was preparing to expose everything. She stared at the screen. They killed him, she said. Because he knew too much. They killed him because he was about to make sure everyone else did too. She sat with that for a long moment. All those nights he'd come home tired. All those calls he'd stepped outside to take. All those times he'd held her a moment longer than necessary at the door. He had been carrying this, the money, the evidence, the careful double life, and beneath all of it, the weight of knowing what it might cost him, and he had done it anyway. For her. The men chasing me, she said. They don't want the evidence. No, Gabriel said. They want the money, the evidence they simply cannot allow to exist. He closed the laptop and looked at her directly, which means they will not stop. A heavy silence settled between them, then Samantha's gaze steadied. So what do we do? Gabriel looked at her for a moment. The lamplight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the dark ink of the tattoo at his collar, the expression of a man who had just made a decision he hadn't entirely planned on making. We do what your husband started, he said. Outside, a phone on Gabriel's desk lit up with an unknown number. They both looked at it. Gabriel picked it up. They've found you, he said quietly, reading something on the screen. The other side of the drive had just become a clock. The number on Gabriel's screen was a blocked line. He answered on the second ring. Said nothing. Waited. The voice on the other end was unhurried, faintly accented. The voice of a man communicating from a position of assumed superiority, the particular tone of someone who believed the conversation had already been decided before it began. Mr. Christian. A pause, weighted and deliberate. We understand you've found something of ours. Gabriel's eyes moved to Samantha. She was watching him with both hands flat on the desk, perfectly still. The posture of someone who had learned in the past several hours that stillness was a form of survival. He held up one finger. Wait, she waited. I don't recall acquiring anything recently, Gabriel said into the phone. His voice carried the same register it always did, low, even, stripped of anything that could be read as either aggression or accommodation, neutral as concrete. The woman, the voice said. She has something that belongs to us. A drive. Financial records. You understand what we're asking. I understand what you think you're asking, Gabriel said. Whether you're asking the right person is a different question. A brief silence. Then, we have no quarrel with you, Mr. Christian. Return what belongs to us. The woman walks away, clean and simple. Gabriel looked at the tattoo on the back of his own hand. The rose, thorned and deliberate. I'll need 24 hours, he said. Another pause, recalculating. 12, 24, Gabriel repeated. Not negotiating, informing. The line went quiet for a moment. Then, 24 hours, Mr. Christian. After that, the conversation changes. The call ended. Gabriel set the phone down and looked at Samantha. They think you'll hand me over, she said. It wasn't an accusation. Just a woman doing the arithmetic of her situation with clear eyes. They think a great many things, Gabriel said. Most of them wrong. He stood and moved to the door. Stay here. He spent the next hour with his security chief, a compact, precise man named Rourke, who communicated primarily in short sentences and had never once in 9 years offered an opinion he hadn't been asked for. They worked through it methodically, the blocked number traced to a relay point 3 districts east. The blocked line triangulated to a building Gabriel already knew. He knew the organization. Not deeply, but enough. They operated in the spaces between larger networks, aggressive, lean, willing to do the things that more established structures outsourced or avoided. They had killed Daniel Cole not because he was a significant threat on his own, but because precedent mattered in that world. You let one man leave with $4 million and evidence of your entire operation? You were no longer an organization. You were an open door. Gabriel understood precedent. He also understood that the call had not been a genuine negotiation. It had been a location confirmation. They now knew Samantha was here, which meant the 24 hours was a courtesy he had no intention of honoring. He called his network east of the river, then 2 contacts further out. He issued instructions with the quiet efficiency of a man who had long ago learned that most problems, when reduced to their essential structure, were simply a matter of knowing which doors to open and which to close before the other party realized a door existed. Then he went back to the study. Samantha was standing at the window when he entered, her arms wrapped around herself, looking out at the courtyard where the rain had finally stopped. The first gray suggestion of dawn was beginning at the edge of the sky. She turned when she heard him. "Tell me what you're doing," she said. It was not a request exactly. The voice of a woman who had been managed and handled and kept at the edge of her own story for long enough. Gabriel told her. Not everything, not the operational details, not the names, but the shape of it. They were going to draw the organization out. Use the promise of the handover to bring the principals into a single location. The meeting they were expecting to control would be one Gabriel had already structured around them. She listened without interrupting. "You've done this before," she said when he finished. "Problem solving," he said simply. "The circumstances change. The method doesn't." She looked at him. "And the men who killed Daniel will be in the room." Something settled in her face. Not satisfaction, it was quieter than that. The particular expression of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already decided they could endure. "What do I do?" she asked. "You stay here, inside the perimeter, with Rourke." She opened her mouth. "Samantha." He said her name with the same level gravity he applied to everything, but something underneath it was different. Closer. "What your husband built on that drive, the evidence, the accounts, none of it means anything if you are not alive to access it. You are not a liability in this. You are the point of it." She closed her mouth, looked at him for a long moment. "Come back," she said quietly. Gabriel held her gaze. Then he picked up his jacket from the chair and walked out. The meeting was set for an industrial property in the Eastern District, a location the organization had suggested, believing the geography favored them. It didn't. Gabriel had used the building twice in previous years for entirely different purposes, and knew its layout the way he knew most useful things completely. And without advertising the knowledge, his convoy arrived 40 minutes early. Rourke's team had already placed men at both secondary exits, the roof access, and the loading dock on the building's eastern face. Not visible, simply present, the way Gabriel preferred his advantages already in position before anyone thought to look. The organization's representatives arrived in 2 vehicles, 4 men visible. Gabriel's team had already identified 2 more positioned on the street outside, a detail the other side believed was subtle. Gabriel walked into the building alone. The tall man with the broken jaw was there. Samantha had described him accurately. He stood in the center of the empty floor space, with the posture of someone who had arranged the room in his mind, already exits, noted, distances calculated. The quiet readiness of a man who expected this to go badly for someone and had decided it wouldn't be him. He looked at Gabriel without the drive. Without Samantha, his jaw tightened. "You came empty-handed," he said. "I came with everything necessary," Gabriel said. The ambush came 40 seconds later, 4 men entering from the south access, 2 more dropping from the mezzanine level. They had clearly prepared it carefully. They had prepared it for a man who hadn't already sealed every entrance from the outside. The doors didn't open. Gabriel's team came through the roof. It was over in minutes. Not because of violence, because of numbers and position and the simple, overwhelming geometry of a situation that had been decided before it began. The tall man was the last to understand it. Gabriel watched him arrive at the realization in real time, the moment a man who believed he was the most dangerous person in a room discovers he is not even close. Gabriel crouched in front of him. "Daniel Cole," he said quietly. "Walk me through it." The man said nothing. Gabriel waited. He was extraordinarily patient, when patience was what the moment required. Eventually the man talked. They always did, when the alternative was made clear enough. Not because Gabriel threatened him with anything theatrical, he simply laid out the situation with the same flat precision he applied to everything, and let the man calculate his own odds. He talked for a long time. Gabriel listened to all of it. When it was over, he stood up, straightened his jacket, and looked at Rourke. Document everything, he said. Then make the calls. He drove back to the estate as the sun was fully rising, pale and clean after the rain, laying long shadows across the courtyard stones. Rourke had already messaged 3 sentences. Principals identified, authorities contacted, evidence package transferred. 23 years of a criminal network, and Daniel Cole had built the case that ended it in a single compressed drive the size of a thumb. Gabriel walked into the house. Samantha was sitting at the bottom of the staircase, still in the oversized coat, feet bandaged, hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he came through the door, and the question in her face was the only one that mattered. "It's done," he said. She pressed both hands over her mouth, and for the first time since any of this had started, Samantha Cole let herself cry. Gabriel stood in the entrance hall and let her. Not moving, not looking away, simply present in the way he was beginning to understand. She needed not comfort exactly, but witness, someone to stand in the room while the grief finally came out. He stayed until it did. The authorities arrived at Gabriel's estate that afternoon, not to question him, at least not primarily. Gabriel had spent years cultivating the kind of relationships with certain institutional figures that existed in the careful gray space between cooperation and distance. He provided, they received. The nature of what passed between them was never discussed directly, which suited everyone. What Daniel had compiled on that drive was extraordinary. Gabriel had known it the moment he'd seen the file structure the night before, but watching the investigator, a lean, unsmiling woman named Farrell, who moved through Gabriel's study like she was memorizing it for a report she'd write later, work through the contents confirmed it. She read in silence for a long time. Then she closed the laptop and looked at Gabriel. "How long has this been assembled?" "The metadata suggests 18 months, Gabriel said. Farrell looked at the drive on the desk between them. "Your husband," she said, turning to Samantha, who was seated in the chair by the window, was meticulous. Samantha had her hands folded in her lap. She had showered, changed into clothes Mrs. Ford had provided, and done the remarkable thing of making herself look composed when Gabriel knew the structure beneath it was held together with something more fragile than composure. She had been doing that since he'd met her. He was beginning to understand it wasn't performance, it was simply how she was built. "Yes," Samantha said. "He was." Farrell looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite softness, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a professional who had learned to keep feeling at a distance, but hadn't managed to excise it entirely. He died trying to do the right thing. Samantha held the woman's gaze. "I know." The investigators spent 4 hours in the study. Gabriel remained present throughout, not because it was required, but because Samantha's eyes moved to him periodically, in a way that told him his presence in the room mattered to her. And he had made a decision without examining exactly when that her sense of safety in this house was something he was willing to be responsible for. The network Daniel had documented was larger than Gabriel had estimated. 11 principals. Shell companies threaded through 4 countries. Evidence connecting the organization to murders, trafficking, corporate fraud on a scale that had apparently been visible to no one because the people positioned to see it had been paid not to. Daniel had documented all of it with the systematic patience of a man who understood he might not survive the project, but intended to complete it regardless. When Farrell finally closed the last file, she sat back and pressed 2 fingers against her mouth and said nothing for a moment. "The offshore account," she said finally, under Mrs. Cole's name, "is clean," Gabriel said. The money was moved in increments over 14 months, converted through legitimate channels. There is nothing in the documentation that implicates Mrs. Cole in any of her husband's prior activities. He paused. "I've had my legal team confirm that." Farrell looked at him. The look of someone deciding how much they want to know about the mechanism of a result they can't argue with. She decided not to ask. "The account is yours," she told Samantha. "It will take time to formally clear, but the money is yours." Samantha nodded once. She didn't look at Gabriel. He understood why. The money was not good news in the way good news usually felt. It was the final piece of evidence that Daniel had known, had planned, had looked at his new wife across kitchen tables and talked about gardens and futures, and quietly, methodically, built her a life raft for a disaster he could see coming and couldn't stop. The grief and the love of it were so tangled together they couldn't be separated. After Farrell and her team left, the house went quiet. Gabriel found Samantha in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, looking out the window at the courtyard where afternoon light was moving through the trees. He came in and stood beside her. "Not close, just present. He knew," she said, not directing it at Gabriel particularly, just saying it into the quiet of the room. "Yes, all that time, He knew what he was involved in, what it could cost. She turned the cup slowly in her hands. And he stayed with me anyway. He let me fall in love with him anyway. Gabriel said nothing. He had learned, over the course of the past day, that Samantha did not always need a response. Sometimes she needed someone to hold the other end of the silence while she worked through what she was carrying. I used to think that was cruel, she said, letting me not know. She paused. I don't think that anymore. What do you think now? She was quiet for a moment. I think he gave me the only clean months he had. The only time in years he was just a person and not a problem to be solved. She looked down at the tea. I think he loved me the best way he knew how to with the life he had. Gabriel looked at the side of her face. The bruise on her cheekbone had moved through its colors, deep purple at the center, yellow at the edges. Her lip had healed to a thin, pale line. He left you more than money, Gabriel said. She looked at him. The evidence. The account. The drive. He paused. He spent 18 months building you a future. That is not the action of a man making peace with losing you. That is the action of a man who intended for you to live. Samantha looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were very steady and very full. The tall man, she said. The one who came to my apartment. In custody, Gabriel said, along with the others. Farrell's team moved on 4 locations this afternoon. And Daniel's killers? Among them. He held her gaze. Your husband's evidence identified them directly. They will not walk away from it. She nodded slowly. Looked back out the window. Is it over? She asked. Gabriel considered the question with the honesty it deserved. The immediate danger is over. The legal process will take time. There will be proceedings. Farrell will need you for some of them. I know. She set the cup down. I can do that. He believed her. Entirely and without qualification. She turned to face him then, fully, and looked at him the way she had in the study that first morning, the direct, clear-eyed look of a woman who had decided to see what was actually in front of her, rather than what was convenient. Gabriel, she said. It was the first time she had used his name without it being a response to something. Just his name. Placed in the air between them like something she'd been deciding whether to put down. Thank you, she said. Not for catching me. For everything after. Gabriel held her gaze. He had been thanked many times in his life. For many things. By many people. It had never once felt like this, like the words were coming from somewhere so unguarded and so genuine that receiving them required something from him too. Get some rest, he said quietly. She almost smiled. Almost. She picked up her tea and walked out of the kitchen, and Gabriel stood at the counter in the afternoon light and looked at the place where she had been standing and understood. With the particular clarity of a man who had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this, that something had shifted in him over the past 24 hours that was not going to shift back. He was not sure yet what to do with that. He stood there a while longer, thinking about it. Mrs. Ford set the passport on Gabriel's desk without comment. This was one of the many things Gabriel valued about her. She had been present for enough chapters of his life to understand that the most useful thing she could offer was competence without curiosity. The passport was clean. The identity behind it was solid, not a fiction but a reconstruction, built on a real foundation that could survive scrutiny. A new name attached to a real history in a city far enough from this one that the distance itself was a kind of protection. A new life, fully formed, waiting to be stepped into. Gabriel looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked it up and went to find Samantha. She was in the garden. He had not known she'd found the garden. It was at the back of the estate, through a door in the south wall, that most people who stayed in the house never discovered a walled rectangle of overgrown hedges and late-season roses, and a stone bench that had been there longer than the house itself. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. She was sitting on the bench with her face turned up toward the sky, eyes closed. The afternoon light moved through the gaps in the hedge and laid thin lines of gold across her hair. The bruise on her cheek had faded to something barely visible. Her feet, in borrowed shoes slightly too large, were planted flat on the old stone path. She looked like someone practicing being still, like someone learning, very carefully, that stillness was safe again. He didn't want to interrupt it. He stood in the doorway for a moment and simply let it be what it was. A woman in a garden in the late afternoon. Breathing, existing, not running. Then she opened her eyes and saw him. She didn't startle. She had stopped startling at his presence. He'd noticed, sometime around the second day. He wasn't sure exactly when it had happened, the shift from wariness to something quieter, but he had noticed it the way he noticed most things, precisely and without comment. He crossed the garden and sat beside her on the bench, leaving appropriate distance between them. He placed the passport in the space between them. She looked at it, then at him. It's real, he said. Everything behind it is real. The name, the history, the records. It will hold up to anything. She picked it up and opened it. Looked at the photograph inside, one taken 2 days ago by Rourke, while she'd been sitting in the kitchen and hadn't noticed. He'd had it processed immediately. Where? She asked. Portugal. A coastal city. Quiet. Warm. He paused. The kind of place where a person can decide who they want to be next. She looked at the photograph for a long time. The account has been formally cleared, he said. Farrell completed the documentation this morning. The money is accessible. My legal team has set up a clean structure for you. A bank in Lisbon. Everything above board. Nothing that connects to any of this. He paused. You will never have to worry about money again. Samantha closed the passport slowly. The garden was quiet around them. A bird moved in the hedge. The light shifted. You arranged all of this, she said. Yes. Why? He had been waiting for the question, had known it would come, had spent 2 days deciding how to answer it. Which was unusual for him. He was not a man who typically required preparation to say what was true. Your husband spent 18 months building you a future he wasn't sure he'd be alive to give you, Gabriel said. It seemed wrong to let that work go unfinished. She looked at him. That's not all of it. He held her gaze. No, he said. It's not. She waited. The night you collapsed, he said, on that street. I have walked past a great many things in my life, Samantha, and made the calculation that they were not mine to stop for. He looked at the old stone path between his feet. I have never once questioned that. It is simply how my world operates. He paused. I stopped for you, and I have not been able to locate the version of myself that would have kept walking. The garden held the silence of that for a moment. Samantha looked at him with the full, unguarded attention she had given him periodically over the past days, the kind of look that cost something and she gave anyway. I don't want to go, she said quietly. I know, Gabriel. My world will not become safer, he said. It was not a warning delivered with distance. It was the opposite, said closely, almost gently, with the specific tenderness of someone choosing honesty over what they wanted. What happened to you this week, the danger, the running, the men at your door in my life, that is not an event. It is the weather. And you deserve better than learning to live in that. She looked away. At the roses along the far wall, overgrown, unpruned, still blooming in the October cold, with the stubborn persistence of things that don't need tending to survive. He used to talk about roses, she said. For the garden we were going to have. Gabriel said nothing. He would have liked this one, she said. They sat with that for a while, neither of them in a hurry. The light moved slowly across the stones. Finally, Samantha looked at the passport in her hands, opened it again to the photograph. The woman in it looked back at her, same face, different name. A door standing open. Will you be all right? She asked. The question surprised him. He felt it land somewhere he hadn't expected. Yes, he said. She nodded. Looked at the photograph one more time. Then she closed the passport and held it in both hands and stood up. Gabriel stood with her. She looked at him, all of him, the full height and the dark suit and the ink at his collar and the expression he'd never quite been able to make readable to anyone, and her eyes were full and steady and clear. You caught me when I fell, she said. And then you put me back on my feet. She pressed her hand briefly, lightly, against his chest just for a moment, just the warmth of it, then let it fall. Not everyone would have done that. Gabriel looked at her hand, then at her face. Your husband died trying to give you a future, he said quietly. I just made sure you got it. She held his gaze one last time, long enough for both of them to know what it was, long enough to feel the full weight of a thing that was real and true and could not be kept. Then she picked up her coat from the bench. The old brown one, Daniel's coat. She folded it over her arm and walked back through the door in the garden wall. Gabriel stood among the overgrown roses and listened to her footsteps cross the stone path, and then the hallway, and then go quiet. He stood there for a long time after that. The garden held its silence around him, and the light moved across the old stones, and somewhere in the city a woman with a new name was beginning to learn what it felt like to walk towards something, instead of away from it. Gabriel looked at the roses along the wall, thought about a man he had never met, who had hummed in the kitchen and talked about gardens and loved someone so carefully that the love had outlasted him. He reached out and straightened one of the stems along the wall. Just the one. A small, unnecessary thing. Then he walked back inside. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.